shining example of the kind of professional outfit that the Weather Bureau wanted to be seen as. Plus, in addition to his work as a weather observer and his role as a father to a young family, Isaac also became an instructor in medical climatology at the University of Texas Medical School that was located in Galveston. Meanwhile, as Isaac and his family were settling into their new home in Galveston, they were also welcoming a new addition in the form of their second daughter, Rosemary. And soon enough, Isaac and his family would be joined by his younger brother, Joseph, who he hired to work at the weather station with him. Then in 1893, amidst a new chief of the Signal Corps, Mark Harrington's attempts to improve the Weather Bureau's reputation, both brothers would enter a competition where each participant was required to write a 3,000-word paper on, quote, weather forecasts and how to improve them. The authors of the 10 best papers were then brought to Washington for a written examination and 2 further weeks of testing their forecasting skills against one another, with the winner of this contest being given a prize professor position in the nation's capital. Now, Isaac, unlike Joseph, would be one of the 10 finalists, ultimately finishing 5th, although he would claim that his final score was just 0.3% behind the winners, as 2 men actually tied for first place, with Willis Moore, the future head of the Bureau, ultimately coming out on top. So Isaac wouldn't be going to Washington for a prize professorship, but instead would be staying in Galveston, where a year later in 1894 his wife Cora May gave birth to their third daughter Esther. By 1900, the year of our hurricane, Isaac was 36 years old. He had grown a mustache and a goatee, and as the chief weatherman in Texas, he was supremely confident in his knowledge of the weather. After all, he was an educated scientist who had studied the works of meteorologists and physical geographers alike. Plus, Isaac himself was a pioneer in medical climatology. Now, to be clear, Isaac was far from alone in this confidence and this sense that he knew and understood everything there was to know about the weather and storms. This was the attitude of many in the Bureau at the time, even though they had no clue about the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic, or that such things as jet streams existed. This supreme confidence in knowing everything while never understanding just how much they did know would prove to be deadly for the people of Galveston. This included Isaac Klein and his family, which in 1900 consisted of 12-year-old Allie Mae, 11-year-old Rosemary, 6-year-old Esther Bellew, and his wife Cora May, who at the time was pregnant with their 4th child. They and Isaac's brother Joseph, who was renting a room from them, all lived in a 2-story home that sat just 3 blocks north of the island's Gulf Shore. The home, which had porches on the front and rear of each floor, noticeably sat atop stilts, which Isaac believed would make it safe from the worst flooding that to his knowledge a storm could generate. Meanwhile, both Isaac and his brother Joseph were down on the 4th floor of the 4-story brick Levi building that sat in the heart of Galveston's commercial district, making their observations and taking their measurements from the Weather Bureau equipment that was set up on the roof of the building, equipment that for much of the summer of 1900 was recording a heat wave that pretty much the entire country was embroiled in. Indeed, according to Western World magazine, quote, the summer of 1900 will long be remembered as one of the most remarkable for sustained high temperature that has been experienced for almost a generation. The heat was seemingly everywhere you went that year, from the Rockies to the eastern seaboard. Springfield, Illinois, for example, experienced 12 straight days of over 90-degree temperatures, which represented the longest heat wave the city had seen in 20 years. Washington, D.C., meanwhile, saw 7 straight days of temperatures over 96 degrees. Such heat was both deadly, as 3 would die in Chicago, and unprecedented, as the Bering Glacier was noted to have shrunk for the first time in recorded history. Then there was Philadelphia, which on the 11th of August had a recorded temperature of 100.6 degrees. Meanwhile, in New York City on that same day, 30 people would die from that heat. This included 3 children who died falling from fire escapes, which they had apparently climbed out onto looking for cool air, as keep in mind this was an era before air conditioning. So everywhere people in the US went, there was just no relief. Trains, for example, were basically just metal boxes that were made hotter by the sun beating down upon them. Carriages also didn't offer any kind of relief, with their black canvas tops and their black enameled bodies that captured the heat. You also have to realize that unlike today, where it's common for people to don shorts, t-shirts, and the like in the summer months, in 1900 men typically wore woolen suits, while women wore taffeta dresses. This extended period of intense heat across the continental United States is especially notable for our story because of the effect it had on the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, which were said to have felt like those in a bath. Waters which then provided ample fuel for the hurricane that was crossing them on its way toward Galveston. Early in the morning of Thursday, Thursday, September the 6th, William Stockman, the Weather Bureau's head man in Cuba, wired the Bureau's main office's estimation that the storm that had passed over the island was now 150 miles to the northeast, a prediction based purely off of speculation and the idea that was how such storms moved and behaved. Willis Moore's forecasters in Washington then used this belief as a basis for interpreting the information that they would subsequently receive from their various other outposts, thereby ensuring that they would ignore any information that suggested a different version of events. Therefore, at 8 in the morning that day, they officially predicted that, quote, "The storm will probably continue northward, and its effects will be felt as far as the lower portion of the middle Atlantic coast by Friday night." The thing is, that was not where the storm was at all, as the steamship Louisiana would find out soon enough. The steamship, you see, had departed from New Orleans that morning with 30 passengers on board, taking a course that, as it turned out, put them directly into the storm. Not knowing how much trouble they were in as the winds and waves began to pick up on Thursday morning, T.P. Halsey, the captain of the Louisiana, ordered the decks cleared and the hatches sealed, even as he continued to plow forward ignorant of the power of the storm he was sailing into. By 6 a.m., though, the power of the winds and the way they seemed to be swirling was probably enough to tell Captain Halsey that they had encountered a tropical cyclone, and that their problems were only just getting started as the ship's barometer was continuing to drop at an ever quicker pace. Halsey then, around noon, likely realizing how much trouble he was in, reduced the speed of his ship to the point that he had just enough power to keep it pointed into the oncoming wind and waves. An hour later, though, their situation continued to worsen as the ship was being battered by winds that the captain estimated had to be more than 100 miles an hour. He also, to his shock, noted that the ship's barometer was lower than he had ever seen it before. This storm, you see, which had been deemed moderate and of no real threat when it passed over Cuba, had subsequently, upon entering the very warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, turned into a monster, and soon Halsey was estimating its winds to be blowing as fast as 150 miles an hour. Now, while the warm Gulf waters explain some increase in strength, the dramatic increase seen in this particular storm is exceedingly rare, and the exact reason for this apparently is still not 100% understood today. That being said, there are some theories of what might have caused this explosive deepening, as it is called. According to Hugh Willoughby, the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Hurricane Research Division, something called a loop current might have been responsible. A loop current, you see, is a flow of warm water from the Caribbean that travels through the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this current isn't a constant occurrence, so we don't know whether or not it was present in this case, but if it was, it could have created a situation where even the storm's powerful winds were not enough to cool the water it was passing over, waters which in and of themselves were already abnormally warm. Then, instead of being cooled at least somewhat by the storm's powerful winds, they were instead just constantly being replenished with more warm water, creating a situation where the storm just kept increasing in strength at a rapid and unexpected rate. Now, Captain Halsey knew nothing of this. All he knew was that the large waves driven by the hurricane's powerful winds were battering his ship, with at least one striking it in such a way that it sent seawater down its ventilation shafts and into the engine room, a situation which, if it occurred enough times, would spell the end of the Louisiana. So the reality of the situation was the moderate storm that had passed over Cuba after mainly dumping a lot of rain on the island had since grown into a monster of a storm, with the kind of high winds and a barometric pressure so low that scientists of the day actually thought it to be impossible. Yet because the Weather Bureau was convinced that the storm had turned for the Atlantic, and because the Cuban hurricane experts who were actually predicting this path and this increase in strength had been cut off from communication due to political games, no one in the path of the storm knew it. Indeed, the Weather Bureau would continue to double down on its mistaken belief that the storm which had passed over Cuba was now making its way up the Atlantic seaboard by issuing a warning to fishermen in New Jersey to stay in port on Friday in anticipation of a storm that was not in fact heading their way. That being said, that same day, the 6th of September at 9:35 Galveston time, Willis Moore would telegraph the Weather Bureau's offices along the Gulf Coast with orders to hoist a flag signaling a storm warning. Apparently, they had noticed that something was up from their observations, but it has to be noted that nowhere in this warning is the word hurricane mentioned. This was then your basic run-of-the-mill storm warning. Seemingly then, while the Weather Bureau had recognized the signs that something was happening out over the Gulf, they continued to dismiss any indication that this might be the same storm that had passed over Cuba. This was likely due to two connected issues, with the primary one being their own surety and confidence that they knew and understood virtually everything there was to know about the weather. Based upon their knowledge and experience, the storm that had passed over Cuba was A, not something to worry about, and B, was now out over the Atlantic and turning to the northeast. Also, tied up in this unrestrained confidence was the Weather Bureau's arrogance when it came to the Cuban weather observers, who kept insisting that the storm that had passed over their island was a hurricane. A hurricane that they believed had grown stronger and was making its way across the Gulf of Mexico toward Texas. The Weather Bureau then, at least subconsciously, blinded themselves to any evidence that may have supported the Cubans' prediction, as they just had to be wrong. Meanwhile, in Galveston, where it was said to have been unbearably humid with the temperatures in the 90s all week, Isaac Klein was awoken by the sounds of large waves hitting the shore near his house. Now, such sizable waves were unusual, as the Gulf was usually very calm, reportedly being more akin to a big lake than an ocean. Isaac then made note of these unusually large crashing waves and the time in between them, which was also markedly long. Such waves were a sure sign that there was a storm somewhere out there in the Gulf. Yet, if Isaac actually suspected that a hurricane was afoot, he issued no warnings to that effect, something which may have potentially been due to the Weather Bureau's strict policy concerning such warnings and the use of the word hurricane. All forecasts had to go through Washington and Willis Moore, especially one of the magnitude of predicting a hurricane. Now, the Galveston Weather Bureau would receive a warning around 11:30 that Friday morning that there was a tropical storm in the Gulf. Noticeably, though, this warning never referred to the storm as a hurricane, and nor did it suggest that the storm was going to be much to worry about, as the forecast for Galveston called for some high northerly winds overnight and potentially heavy rain on Saturday. Isaac, too, despite noting the waves, did not seem to realize the threat that they portended, and nor did his instruments provide him with much of a warning. For example, the atmospheric pressure had only dropped slightly from the night before, so there really wasn't much of a reason to think that one of the worst storms in history was bearing down on their little exposed island. Indeed, Isaac sprang to the Bureau when questioned about the potential storm by one Captain George B. Hicks of the ship the Alamo, would declare that the expected storm was nothing much to worry about, as it was only a quote-unquote offspur of a storm that had hit Florida. In addition to the Weather Bureau itself seemingly not considering this storm to be much of a threat, there was also Isaac's own confidence that Galveston was not especially vulnerable to a hurricane, a belief based upon the accepted science of the day and from Isaac's own experience in Galveston when a storm in 1891 failed to have much of an impact on his fair city. Indeed, earlier that very year in 1900, a series of tropical storms had swept through Galveston from mid-July to mid-August, and they had all done little but drop a lot of rain on the city. One storm, in fact, had dropped 16 inches of rain in 48 hours, which was a record for the city, but all that had done was cause a little flooding. Isaac was in fact so confident that he had written an article on the subject of hurricanes that had been published by the Galveston News in 1891. In this article, Isaac would declare that full-fledged hurricanes could not generally actually hit Texas. According to Isaac, the combination of the Earth's rotation, trade winds, and various other variables made it so that hurricanes formed near the equator, which took a northwesterly direction, nearly always took a curving path back to the northeast. As proof of this, Isaac would point to the last 2 decades, during which time only 2 storms had actually made it to Texas. Storms that he insisted had to have been influenced by some fluke occurrence. Storms which by definition then tended to be weak due to these unusual circumstances. Isaac then insisted in his article that due to these facts, the Texas coast, where again Galveston was located, was, quote, much less susceptible to damaging or dangerous weather than many other places in the U.S. In fact, he asserted that the 2 hurricanes that had struck the region in the last 2 decades had done less property damage than the average Midwest tornado. The problem with this argument, though, is the focus on property damage, as it ignored the true cause of these 2 storms, particularly when it came to human life. These 2 storms, you see, had struck Indianola, which lay 150 miles southwest of Galveston. The first of these storms had then killed 176 individuals, which was equivalent to a full fifth of Indianola's population. Now, the residents of that seaside community were resilient and they would rebuild following this first storm, but when a second storm struck, their losses were enough that they simply abandoned Indianola permanently. Now, whether Isaac obscured this on purpose as a way of promoting Galveston in its ongoing competition to be the nation's next great city, or because he just wasn't really aware of all the facts is unclear. That being said, the local authorities in Galveston had apparently taken some note of these storms and the fact that their island city was, if anything, even more exposed than Indianola had been, and so they proposed the construction of a 10-foot-high seawall to protect Galveston from flooding due to a hurricane. Yet, by the time the state got around to approving the funding for the project, the officials in Galveston had apparently decided that the chances of their getting hit by a storm were so slim that they didn't need to bother with such a complicated and costly project. Which to me seems like a crazy conclusion, but it does go to show you that Isaac was far from alone in his confidence.